My name is Dr. Niall Blunt. I am the McPherson Director of Academic Programs here at the Memorial Art Gallery. I am also an Assistant Professor of Curatorial Practice in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Rochester. I have the distinct honor of welcoming you to MAG's first public event centered on our exhibition National Anthem by the acclaimed German-Japanese-American contemporary artist Kota Ezawa. So the exhibition in our former gallery, Kota Ezawa's National Anthem, which was organized by Lauren Tagliaferro, came to MAG as a result of the efforts of a number of very generous supporters of the museum. The installation is comprised of 3 loans and 1 gift of Ezawa's work, parts of which were included in the Venice Biennale in 2019 and were first exhibited in this city in the fall of 2020 by Rochester's premier commercial gallery. We at MAG are deeply grateful to those passionate and generous friends of the museum and patrons of the arts for allowing us the opportunity to share this work with the greater Rochester community. Some of the names of those people appear on the credit line under the artwork on the screen. I'm also immensely grateful to all of the MAG staff involved in bringing today's event to fruition, with a special nod, as always, to Chio Oyama of the Academic Programs Department for the special role that she plays in facilitating and managing many of the aspects of my department's public programming. Given its prominence of place as the first exhibition that every visitor sees when they pass through the glass doors to the galleries, we are delighted to host this afternoon's talk, which will offer keen insights into the multivalent cultural and historical contexts of the social movement that serves as the theme of the exhibition. I have personally been looking forward to today's talk because no one that I know is better positioned to offer a view into the social and cultural milieu out of which the theme of the exhibition emerged than today's speaker. Dr. Stephen Brauer is Associate Professor and Chair of the English Department at St. John Fisher College, where he teaches courses in American literature and American culture. Throughout his career, he has offered classes in English, American studies, gender studies, sports studies, and the arts. Although he has published articles on Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and Faulkner's Sanctuary, he identifies not so much as a literary critic, but as a cultural critic and historian. Indeed, he has published essays on the television series Mad Men, David Fincher's film version of Fight Club, concussions in sport, and on the football player Terrell Owens. More notably, he is the author of the just-published book, Criminality and the Modern, Contingency and Agency in 20th Century America. Recently, he has begun an exciting project on the function of sport in American culture over the last century. Today's presentation, which promises to have both scholarly and popular appeal, emerges from his current research and this particular cultural interest. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brauer.
I want to thank Jonathan Binsock and Niall for the invitation to come speak here today. It's a real pleasure and something I'm really grateful for the opportunity to sort of start thinking with other people about some of the ideas I've been paying attention to for a bit. This is an afternoon that really combines 3 of my real passions, which is cultural history, art, and sports. And it's wonderful for me to be able to talk about sports in a way that isn't just, oh, I was watching ESPN last night, which is what my students always want to talk about, but I always want to like, yeah, that's easy stuff, let's have fun. So let me just, Ezawa's National Anthem is a suite of artworks which combine watercolors, light boxes, and an animated film. He began them in 2017, and he completed them in 2019. He was born outside of Stuttgart, Germany in 1969. He's of Japanese-American descent. He came to San Francisco in 1994. He received his BFA from San Francisco Art Institute in 1995 and an MFA from Stanford in 2003, and he continues to reside in the San Francisco Bay Area. This work debuted at the Whitney Biennial in 2019, It came first to Rochester, as Niall mentioned, in the fall of 2020, which is when I first saw a number of the pieces here and was as excited as I could be to see them and to be in conversation with other people about what was going on with them. And then it debuted at MAG, of course, in November 21, last fall, and we are experiencing that now. As I talk about this work, I'm going to be trying to ground it a little bit in some social and cultural history that has to do with sport, it has to do a little bit with politics, and it has to do with the history of protest. And so I want to begin with this image. This is an image of Colin Kaepernick protesting on August 26, 2016. It was the first time someone had taken a photograph of him doing this, although he had been doing it for 2 previous weeks. He was sitting during the national anthem. This was a preseason game. As some described it, it was fairly meaningless. It doesn't really count in the win-loss record at all. It's a chance for some players to make the team and other players to get back up to speed for the regular season. Kaepernick was coming back from an injury at this point in time. He was somewhat of a backup quarterback. He was soon going to be named a backup officially. But one of the things worth noting in this image is when we see it like this is a photographer who just noticed it all of a sudden. Kaepernick is actually hard to find at all at first blush. You have to look for a little bit to realize that he's in the middle of the frame amongst the water coolers, number 7. Most people are standing, as they often do, as most players would be doing, but Kaepernick was not. He had been sitting for 2 previous games, but no one had noticed. After the game, the media became interested in what he had to say and why he was doing this. And he said, "I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color. To me, this is bigger than football. And it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. There are bodies in the street and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder." As we can imagine, this made some headlines. Because we hadn't seen something quite like this, or certainly hadn't felt like this in the National Football League, which is, at this point, I think fair to say, surpassed baseball as America's national pastime. The popularity has really exploded in the last 20 years. During that week, a former Green Beret and football player who had played in Texas and had been trying out with the Seattle Seahawks named Nate Boyer wrote an open letter to Kaepernick, wanting to talk to him about what it meant to him that he was kneeling during the national anthem. And Boyer published this in the Army Times. Kaepernick reached out to him within days and said, "Let's meet. Come to the next game." So Boyer did. He accepted that invitation, and they spoke before the game, and Boyer suggested that maybe you should kneel rather than sit as a sign of respect. Kneeling is seen as a much more respectful thing. People do it when they pray. Excuse me. And so Kaepernick actually thought that was a great idea. And so this is the photograph taken at that next game on September 1st, 2016. As we can see, the media presence is escalating dramatically, considering that someone needs to be in a different place to take that photograph than what we saw before, which was from way up in the press box. There is much more media presence at this game. Still a preseason game, not something people pay a lot of attention to, generally speaking. As I said, the starters play about 10 to 15 minutes at most and then get out so they don't get hurt. But the press came out for this game. People were very interested in what was going on. Not seen in this photo from this particular angle, but others are that he did have a teammate kneeling next to him by the name of Eric Reed, who was an all-pro safety for the team. And that is Nate Boyer standing directly next to Kaepernick on the right of the screen with his hand over his heart, and has been sort of part of Kaepernick's journey since. As most of us know, the protests began to take hold in the fall of 2016 with players from pretty much all teams on some level either choosing to kneel, to raise their fist, to link arms, to join in solidarity in protest. It didn't just stop at professional football. Professional soccer and other sports, absolutely we saw players, again, protesting in some ways against racial injustice, oppression, police brutality. It traveled to college games. It traveled to high schools. When I went to see my son play soccer at a private school game in that fall, I saw players from the other team kneeling. So it had caught a cultural wind, as it were. But throughout, these are, I should mention, silent, peaceful, nonviolent protests. There's no interruption of a game. It has to do with the activity that takes place before the game. Nonetheless, these actions were framed as unpatriotic and un-American. I'm just going to pause here, and I'm going to go back to the previous slide because I want to talk about this photo a little bit more. Because I first saw this photo or read about it when I was in, of all places, Tallinn, Estonia. And I was there for an academic conference with a number of people from the University of Rochester, excited to be in a different country, excited to be in a different place, far away. But I checked my phone when I got home that night, which is always a mistake, and my wife's always telling me not to do that. And I discovered that this news was breaking, and I said, this is a big deal. And she was not much interested in that because it was late. But I said, no, this is a really big deal. And it was partly a big deal because I was about to start teaching a class called Sport and American Culture in 3 days. And so what that meant was, to me, I have to tear up my entire syllabus because this is not something that we see a lot of, and we don't see it at this scale in this big a sport. And, she was like, just don't turn the light on. Can you do it without the light? Because I want to go to sleep. And I did, but I really had to tear up my entire syllabus while being at this conference and sort of taking some time here and there to try to, because I could tell this was really going to matter on some level. Because again, in the NFL, you don't see a lot of people working against the grain because it's a big team sport and people like uniformity. And so I knew something would happen. I didn't know what quite would happen. But I also could see there was a lot of media coverage of this thing for a preseason game. And then again, when next week happened, this was really something. So I was teaching a course in sport and American culture at the time, which I had done before, but I realized I had to do it differently because what was going in our first unit was all about taking a knee. And the students were an interesting group, and they described it first in these ways. This is anti-military, this is anti-police, this is anti-American. He's just trying to get attention. He's trying to make more money. And so I would ask them questions such as, why would a backup quarterback want more attention? That's not going to help him play. He already has a contract. I don't think this sounds like something that would make him more money. It seems like a problem. And so we decided to do a lot about it. And looking into what people were saying, trying to get a bunch of different perspectives, why people might think that such a gesture on his part was anti-American. He talked about what he was doing as actually deeply American, protesting for something he believed using his First Amendment rights. And there are lots of different positions on this. I understand that, and there may be questions about that for sure. But really what struck me was the Clemson football coach who goes by the name Dabo Swinney saying later on in September, one of the things I know, he said, is that Martin Luther King Jr. would never kneel. And I read this aloud to my students, and they were looking at me, and they did not have the same response you did. And I said, so I think we're going to read Letter from Birmingham Jail next. I want to read a little bit about this history of protest and what nonviolent protest means and what it means to engage in things that are of deep concern to us as individuals. And so that really was, sadly, in some ways, a godsend for me as a professor because it became the material to really extend this and recognize that it has a history in American culture that goes much deeper than what was happening those afternoons at around 1 p.m. And so it was of great value. One of the things I really wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about the historical precedents of African-American athletes protesting injustice and oppression, because Colin Kaepernick was clearly not the first person to do this. Athletes have a big platform, as we would call it today. They are on a big stage. And some of them use that stage and that platform in this way to give voice. We sometimes see this, we used to see this often at the Academy Awards when someone accepted an award or chose not to and sent someone else up talking about social and cultural issues. And so I'm going to just take us through a couple of these just to give you a sense of what has happened in the past in terms of African-American athletes doing this. And the first has to do with the Boston Celtics preseason strike. Well, that team was in Louisville to play a preseason game there from Boston. And Sam Jones and Satch Sanders, two of the bigger players on the team, were refused service in a coffee shop. So they came back and they told Bill Russell, a name you might be familiar with, about this. And the three of them said, we're not playing. We're not playing here. And they went to Coach Red Auerbach and they said, we're not going to do this. We're going back to Boston. And at first he's like, guys, come on. I'd really like you to play. But they talked to him about it and he said, I'll drive you to the airport. And they flew home. And they struck. They had no interest in playing in Louisville. And it was one of the first times we saw people at that level saying no. And this is in 1961. It's tapping into a lot of things going on and emerging in the civil rights movement. The next example is the 1965 AFL All-Star Game, when we're talking football here, before the AFL and NFL merged in the way that we have it now. Well, after being subjected to repeated racist and prejudicial treatment in New Orleans, which was hosting the All-Star Game that year, all 21 black players in this game decided to strike. All 21. They consciously refused to play in the game. They said, we're not going to do it after everything that's been going on here to us, since literally getting off the plane and being told they cannot take a taxi to their hotel. Good luck. They basically said, we're not going to play. We're not going to do this. And they went to the, the coaches and the GMs and the owners and said, we're not going to do this. And it turned out that a number of white players, and this included the quarterback and future Congressman Jack Kemp, supported them. And they announced that they're going to join that strike, that they're not going to play either. Well, the AFL decided to move the game immediately to Houston, where they had better treatment, and the game went on as scheduled. So two of these examples, again, this is in the heart of sort of the civil rights movement. We see players refusing to play based on treatment they're having in certain areas. The 1969 Wyoming football team. This team had a ranking of number 16 in the country. In mid-October, they were 4-0, and they had 14 black players who wanted to wear black armbands in their upcoming game against BYU. The reason they wanted to do that was because they were very frustrated the year before when these racial epithets were shouted at them during the game against BYU. They didn't really want to deal with that anymore. They wanted to find a way, again, of silent protest about the way they were being treated. There's also the fact that at that point in time, the Church of Latter-day Saints excluded blacks from their priesthood. And they felt, again, that notions of exclusion, of treatment, were not okay. They were trying to use what they could to protest this. When the players approached the coach with the plan, he did not support them and instead immediately kicked them all off the team within 10 minutes. He said, you don't get to play for me. The team then lost 4 to the next 6 games, went 1-9 the following year, and that coach was fired. The 1970 Syracuse football team. It began in 1969 by 9 Syracuse football players, often misidentified as the Syracuse 8. Some people in this area might remember the Syracuse 8. There were actually 9 players. They called in 1969 for an end to systemic racism in the Syracuse football program. The players had 4 demands. They wanted equal access to academic tutors and advisors. They didn't have the same. They did not have the same medical treatment and wanted better access to medical facilities and care. They wanted what they called an equitable and transparent system of determining who travels to away games and who plays. By that, they meant that Syracuse had a system in which they would only bring so many black players to a game that was away, that they would limit and sort of have a quota on how many they would do, and they wanted that to be a little more transparent, equitable, and based on talent, skill level, and value to the team, not on race. And their final request was a diversifying of the coaching staff. They struck during spring football. Those 9 players refused to play, and then through the entirety of the regular football season in the fall, because the coach refused to make any of those changes. Despite an authorized report by the college in December of that year that supported their claims of racism, little actually changed. Only one of them ever played for Syracuse again. So those are 4 that come to mind in sort of a very heightened era of the civil rights movement of the 60s and early 70s that we can see. I'll be coming back to one that perhaps is more well known. But first I want to speak a little bit about Mahmoud Abdul Rauf. Mahmoud played in college under the name Chris Jackson. He was a consensus All-American for 2 consecutive years at Louisiana State University. He was the 3rd overall draft pick in the NBA in 1990. He was the most improved player in 1993. He played in the NBA for 9 years. Denver Nuggets, the team that drafted him, the Sacramento Kings, and the Vancouver Grizzlies. In the 1995-96 season, he averaged career highs in points. He had 19.2 points a game and 6.8 assists. Both of those were career highs, especially for really quite nice for a guy who came off the bench for part of his time there. Mahmoud also converted to Islam in 1991, and he stopped standing for the national anthem during that season, career best 1995-96 season, as a response to what he called systemic racism in America. He felt the flag and the anthem represented that oppression. He stopped standing for 4 months before anyone noticed. But then they did, and within a day, he was suspended on March 12th, 1996. And I'll talk a little more about how the NBA had a rule that you had to stand for the national anthem. 2 days later, on March 12th, Mahmoud reached a compromise with the NBA. He agreed to stand but close his eyes and look downward, and he would pray during that time, as we see in this image here. He had an outstanding year for the Denver Nuggets. Then he was traded to Sacramento, which was one of the worst teams in the league. His playing time crashed. His statistics took a downward turn. He was out of the league by 1998 when his contract expired. This is an image I'm going to guess is a little more familiar with a lot of people. This takes place at the Mexico City Olympics and features Tommy Smith, who won the gold medal, and John Carlos, who won the bronze. We can see them here in the center and to the right of the image. And they're on the podium accepting medals for the 200-meter race in the Summer Olympics in '68. During the playing of the anthem, as we can see here, each bowed his head and raised a black-gloved fist for the entirety of the song, along with the silver medalist, who was Australian Peter Norman. Each wore a human rights badge on their uniform. The 2 U.S. athletes, it's hard to see in this image, received their medals shoeless, but wearing black socks to represent black poverty. Smith wore a black scarf around his neck to represent black pride. Carlos had his tracksuit top unzipped to show solidarity with blue-collar workers in the United States, and he wore a necklace of beads, which, as he described, quote, were for those individuals that were lynched or killed, and that no one said a prayer for, those who were hung and tarred. Well, as I said, most of you are familiar with this image because it was blasted everywhere immediately. And they came under heavy criticism. Smith and Carlos were ostracized by the entire U.S. sporting establishment. They faced constant abuse back home, and they received death threats for what you see right there. Time magazine wrote in late October 1968, quote, faster, higher, stronger is the motto of the Olympic Games. Angrier, nastier, uglier better describes the scene in Mexico City last week. Brent Musburger, who most people came to know as a broadcaster for CBS and ESPN, became a national broadcaster, was working for the Chicago American at the time as a reporter. Well, Mr. Musburger described Smith and Carlos as, quote, a couple of black-skinned stormtroopers who were ignoble, juvenile, and unimaginative. Because of the scope of the event, the Summer Olympics, track and field event, which tend to be one of the more popular sports, this protest became what I'm calling a media spectacle. And I'm going to harken back both with the treatment of what happened at the Olympics, as well as the treatment of what happened with Mahmoud Abdul a couple of times as we move back to Ezawa's national anthem. I want to just give a brief history of the anthem for you all. Many of you will know this. It was penned by Francis Scott Key as a poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry. In 1814, it was set to a song, a rather popular song at the time, and became familiarly known as the Star-Spangled Banner. It became official as in use by the U.S. Navy in 1889, and then by President Woodrow Wilson in 1916, and it was only in 1931 that it actually became the national anthem. It was the 6th time that a U.S. congressman had proposed that bill, and at this moment in time, it became official and signed into the resolution was signed into law by President Herbert Hoover in May 1931. I'd like to think a little bit, if I could, with you all about the national anthem being played at sporting events. It turns out that this Star-Spangled Banner was played in baseball games beginning in the 19th century, long before it was the actual national anthem. It was used, generally speaking, more during wartime, especially World War I and World War II in the last 100 years or so. Following World War I, it was in frequent use in Major League Baseball, especially during the 7th inning stretch. Now we sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," perhaps, but this is what they sang back then. It became commonplace in Major League Baseball in the NFL after World War II, and it has been a long-standing NBA rule that all players must stand for the anthem. I want to pause and think about this question of the national anthem of sporting events. Because as I watched my son play high school soccer in the fall of 2016 and watched people on the other team kneel, one of the things I remember asking my wife is, why do they play this at athletic contests? Why do they play this at games? I said, they don't play it before the school play. They don't play it before the school debates. We didn't play it this afternoon before I started speaking. What is it about sports that people think this is the appropriate moment to play the national anthem that is distinct from other events when people gather? Why here? Why in this way? Why an inconsistency, one might ask? If here, why not at the others? If not there, why at sports? Why is this only considered a problem if someone kneels here? There weren't really any answers to that. I'm not sure there continue to be answers to that, but it's something I want us to keep in mind. What is it about sports that people think the national anthem is appropriate at that moment? In the Olympics, perhaps we understand because you're representing a country. But the San Francisco 49ers are not representing San Francisco. They play in San Jose. As we like to say up here, there's only one team that actually plays in the state of New York, and it's neither the Jets nor the Giants. So I want us to have in the back of our mind a little bit about this relationship between sports and what we might think of as a patriotic moment, and how we're supposed to respond in that patriotic moment accordingly. There's been a long history of the national anthem in the NFL. It was first began to be played in 1941, 1942. In 1945, after World War II, the NFL commissioner, who was named Elmer Layden, mandated that the anthem, and I quote here because I love this so much, "The anthem should be as much a part of every game as the kickoff." The reason I love that is the anthem is not part of the game. It takes place before the game actually starts. There's no football involved in it. So the deep relationship, though, is being articulated between a certain notion of country and the game itself. And the NFL sees itself as part of that. Starting in 2009 and not before, the NFL players had to stand on the field for the anthem before the start of primetime games. Eventually, this became a mandate for every game. And so what's key in there is that previously players only stood on the field before the game during the Super Bowl and on 9/11 itself. So I want to tell you and make sure this is clear. Before 2009, They weren't on the field during the anthem. This is less than 15 years old, this gesture of having players stand there. So when people talk about a long tradition of players doing that, they're wrong. There isn't a long tradition. It's a recent event. Before 2018, according to the NFL Handbook for Players themselves, players were encouraged but not required to stand during the national anthem. Pre-2018, because in 2018, the Commissioner, Roger Goodell, changed that rule and said you need to stand. And we'll talk a little bit about this. But next I want to think a little bit about the NFL in the United States military, because there is a long history of the relationship between the NFL and the military, as we can see even with the use of the national anthem, as I mentioned before. But if you think about football, and those of you who watch it, listen to it, enjoy it, there's a deep-seated rhetoric influenced by military terms. Players are called gladiators. The field is referenced as a battlefield. Linemen are battling in the trenches. Sometimes it's even compared to a war in that the troops are fighting, and so on, and so on. That rhetoric forms a linguistic, and this is my English professor side coming out, forms a linguistic relationship of symbiosis between soldiers and football players. This is problematic at best for both sides. Soldiers are not playing a game. Their lives are at risk. And NFL players are not at war in any way whatsoever. And calling them that belittles the work of our military servicemen and servicewomen. Still, it's not hard to find that rhetoric existing to this day. Eventually, that relationship between the military and the league evolved into a financial one. In 2015, Republican Senators John McCain and Jeff Flake, both from Arizona, detailed in a report a financial relationship in which the Department of Defense used soldiers and military equipment and resources at professional sporting events. This was what the two senators called paid patriotism. These were taxpayer-funded patriotic displays in the NFL, as well as in Major League Baseball, the NHL, and Major League Soccer. So what does this paid patriotism look like? Well, how many of you have been to a game where you see those jets fly over before the start of the game at the end of the... Yeah, that was paid for. They're not just there. Someone's paying for that. Those military reunions with family, when they bring back soldiers from overseas and surprise their family, those are orchestrated in advance and paid for. They're not just happy circumstances. The NFL likes to buy tickets for soldiers and bring them on the field and show them on the screens both at home and at the stadium. They like to highlight hometown heroes who are servicemen and servicewomen. And of course, the national anthem ceremonies themselves, where we have honor guards, often military bands playing. All of these parts of an NFL game, or at least the ceremonies, are paid for. They're arranged in advance as part of a marketing strategy. They are not, as I've mentioned, part of the game itself. They're part of the experience of what it means to watch the game, however, especially for those in the stadium, but certainly for those at home. Now, that program officially stopped a few years ago, but the NFL continues to have a month in November, at least a couple of weeks, dedicated to what they call Salute to Service. And this fall, I stood in my living room taking picture after picture after picture of the ways in which the uniforms adopted camouflage, including the wristbands, the socks, the headbands that they would wear around, the coaches wearing uniforms that were influenced by camouflage, and commercial after commercial after commercial dedicated to men and women in troops, men and women in service to the country in this regard. That relationship, in other words, continues. It's deeply important to the NFL. So with all of this context, I'd like us to come back to Ezawa. The subject matter here of his work is a depiction of NFL player protests in 2016 against police brutality of people of color and racial injustice and oppression in the United States. The style, this work is painted in a flattened style that focuses on particular elements that we're going to talk a little more about as we look at it. It began with watercolors, then light boxes, and then animation. He would painted over 200 individual watercolors that went into the animated film, each image painted 3 times, and he was working from repurposed television footage. In the film that we see out here, behind this wall, the film follows and mimics the movements of a camera that we would see through the television screen. So when the movement of the camera is happening, that is the panning that's happening from the cameraman on the field showing those players. It also shows media photographers and cameramen within the frame of the shots, so that not only do we see the players, we see the media members sometimes who are creating those images. And I will be coming back to that as we go a little forward here. The Buffalo Bills. I was at this game. I remember this game. I want to talk a little bit about each image to a degree. I'm not an art historian, though I am married to one. That certainly helps a little bit. Just to get a sense of what Ezawa's work, how it operates, what it does. So when I saw this work for the first time, I couldn't help but be struck by the use of the diagonal. What is a clear and striking diagonal across the canvas that really controls the image. And one of the things that happens is the bleeding together of players. Ezawa's framing of this is very geometric in that regard. And I was very struck by that. Having been at the game, I can tell you, it didn't necessarily feel that way as a fan. And I can tell you that Colin Kaepernick said at the end of that season, the worst treatment he faced in any away game was in Buffalo. This is the one Cleveland Browns. It was in the original image we saw as we came in and sat down. Again, an image I really love, in part because of its, again, geometry. The use of the horizontal is so striking, and there are a number of horizontals. The bench at the top of the image, the flag, and that is the flag, the giant U.S. flag. At the bottom, one is in red, one is in blue, and then you have the players' uniforms forming the white. It's a highly ordered image, it seems to me. There is a lot of uniformity across. Every single person is facing towards what we might see as this screen here, except for 2 people. There are 2 people who are not facing us. One is a photographer, and one is a cameraman. And they are near the bottom. The cameraman is dressed in sort of a green, light green vest. The cameraman you can see right above the red, right below player number 31, shooting footage. Everyone else is facing the screen. So it's a great deal of uniformity. There's a great deal of, as I said, geometry to this image, it seems to me. And then we have 2 people who are different. I think that's useful to remember as we move to this image. When I saw this image for the first time in fall 20, I was really struck by a couple of things. It's a much busier canvas compositionally than a lot of the other images in the series. There's still a strong use of horizontals, it seems to me. But one of the things that's really striking is it took me a pretty long time to find Colin Kaepernick in this image. He is not the focus of this. Our eye does not first travel to him, and I would actually argue that our eye actually travels to the flag near the bottom because it's the white space. It pulls the eye away from Kaepernick and more to the men holding that flag up, who are military servicemen. So what this image does is take us away from the protest and towards. That's the cropping of that, the framing of the image in this way serves to place the protest in a slightly different context, perhaps, than the image we saw earlier of Kaepernick in the photograph standing next to Nate Boyer, kneeling next to Nate Boyer. That image was cropped in a slightly different way so that we didn't see the servicemen and we saw Kaepernick. Ezawa then repositions a little bit about what is happening on the field. All three of these, I would add, are interesting because of the framing. Again, having seen one of the games, it's actually quite hard to find, or it was quite hard to find, the players who were kneeling. Similar to when Kaepernick was sitting on the bench, you don't see him, you have to look hard for him. And on the field, there are hundreds of people there. Two teams, lots of coaches, lots of staff. It is very hard to find the group of people, especially early in the season, who were kneeling. Ezawa's work reminds us of that, it seems to me, and changes the context of what we're seeing in these moments, so that we can see the protest as something of much larger. When we see the images, as we'll talk about in the animated film, we're seeing images that are being transmitted by the cameramen on the field. But for those people in the stands, and even those people at home who are getting a longer view, closer to a bird's eye view, the protest seems much smaller, less obtrusive, less invasive. And it has a much different feel in that regard. So the animated film itself, I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. What we see, and I suspect after this we'll go and watch it again and maybe take a look at what you see. You'll see a representation of players. They are silent. They are almost entirely motionless. They are very ordered. The geometry I'm talking about in the painting shows up in the film as well. There's also a great deal of solidarity and unity across teams. You realize there's a lot of different uniforms in this film. And these players are all seen together. Not all are kneeling, not all are standing, but they're often linked in arms, or someone has a hand on someone's shoulder. They're teams, and they come across that way. They come across as united. I'm going to argue that in contrast to this, we have members of the media who are not shown in the same way. Because there is, as I've mentioned earlier, the film has movement in it from the camera itself that is picking up the camera footage from the broadcasts. Within those frames, there are only 5 moments, 5, of movement within the frame. Each person who moves is a media member, is a cameraman. Those are the only people who move in the film, within the film itself, are people who are moving to get a different angle for their shot. None of the players move, it's just them. And I'm suggesting that I'm not really worried about intention here, but that movement becomes obtrusive to our experience of watching the film. And what it starts to do is what I'm calling privilege the imposed frame. We become very aware that how they're framing this experience of watching these protests is through their way of seeing it. It also tells us there might be other ways of seeing and receiving what's happening on that field. That they're imposing a narrative that need not be the only narrative we understand. Here's what it looked like when Colin Kaepernick kneeled on September 1st from a different angle. It takes a minute to find him. He's near the bottom. He's one of many, many people. Only 2 people are kneeling. There are other ulterior narratives and frames through which we can experience these events. We were being presented a particular narrative that was serving a particular goal. I find this image incredibly useful to flip that narrative and understand it in a more complicated way. To help me with this, I offer you this quote from Chloe Weima in art form, reviewing Ezawa's suite of works. And she writes, appropriating footage from multiple football games, this film wrests its source material from the bilious churn of the 21st century culture war, using laborious facture to create an intimate, time-based relic of solidarity. Here, as elsewhere, the biennial prompts you to hold a kind of double image in mind of the thing itself in front of you and of the painstaking, unseen act of making, offered as equally important as what you see. And again, through this passage, I want to emphasize a few things. These are silent, nonviolent protests. They emerge out of a tradition of nonviolent protest. Her phrasing of the bilious churn of 21st century cultural warfare, it seems to me, points very nicely to how images are used to particular effect by different groups. But the film does show a solidarity that's quite powerful. And the film, as a thing in and of itself, something made, is important to recall and consider as you watch it. Because the film is a thing in and of itself, but it also is a thing that reveals that something else has been made and presented to us. By mimicking and representing the thing we were shown, I'm arguing the film actually subverts those images being presented to us through our television sets and undercuts it by showing the players steady, silent, respectful, in the media as the one moving, framing, intruding. Why does it matter? Here are just two images. A burning of Kaepernick's jersey and a Kaepernick doll hanging from a tailpipe from a pickup truck. The protests, as mediated, had an effect. They created a spectacle, much like what happened in Mexico City. What's happened since was a creation. It was a particular story that emerged. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions, comments, thoughts. Yes.
Hi. I only have a comment. A very interesting talk. Thank you very much. It calls to mind the book For All the World to See by Maurice Berger, which was about the way in which the media mediated the civil rights protests of the 60s and 70s. And it's an argument for the central role that the media plays in these kinds of activities that happen in the United States.
Absolutely, and thank you, Jonathan. It's when I first began teaching that course, Sport and American Culture, a lot of what I spent time with my students on was the way in which sports are mediated to us in very particular ways. One of the things that has struck me in going to Buffalo Bills games over the years is how people will be in the stands with the field in front of them, but they don't look at the field during the play. They actually watch the scoreboard showing a televised version of what's on in front. So they literally will look away from the play toward the scoreboard showing the play. So the influence of mediation is so strong, it becomes habit. And when I show and demonstrate through looking at an entire Monday Night Football telecast, how each game is presented as a story. This is the chance for Coach A to get revenge on Coach B, or this, the mentor meets the mentee, all those types of narratives, as I like to remind my students, the players don't care. They are trying desperately to do their job that's very complicated because a 300-pound lineman is right next to them, and they are actually They have their hands full with that. They're not really worried about the coaches' relationship and how it's gone bad in the last few years. Yes, absolutely. So there's always narratives being presented to us within sports, and sports is a great arena through which we can see larger cultural things happening. It's very useful. A lot of what happened in 2016 was really speaking to a very bilious presidential election campaign. They were going hand in hand, and this continued for a couple of years, as I said, all the way to 2018, when they said, no, the NFL said, no, you have to stand now. But eventually, after the death of George Floyd, in the way in which players then really found a voice in a different way, and not just remain silent, Roger Goodell, for the first time, acknowledged that there's racial oppression in America, and there are issues going on in the NFL. He had never said that, no commissioner had. It changed a lot of things. And it might not surprise us that during that same time period, in, 2020, was when NBA players refused to play in the bubble, led by the Milwaukee Bucks. They struck, some people like to call that a boycott. For me, a boycott is when people refuse to buy something. When we refuse to do our labor, that's called a strike. They refused to do their labor, and the games stopped. They found power, and they were forced their leagues to listen to them in a different way. They reclaimed their narratives. So thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious about the role that Nate Boyer, I think, played in all this. You said there was only one person other than Colin Kaepernick that was shown kneeling in that.
In that image, yeah.
Was that him, or was it somebody else?
No, Nate Boyer remained standing. To him, he told Colin Kaepernick that it was important for him to stand, but that he supported his kneeling. The person kneeling...
Yeah, who's somebody right to his right there?
Yeah, that is Eric Reed, who is a safety for the San Francisco 49ers. Again, this is a preseason game. Not all starters dress. Eric Reed was an all-pro safety, and he wasn't going to play in that game.
Did Reed speak out in support of Colin Kaepernick?
He sure did, yes. The entire season he did the same thing. He knelt next to him the entire season. Reed was under contract through the following season, at which point his contract was not renewed, even though he was an all-pro safety. He struggled to find work in the NFL for a few months, and then in October, the Carolina Panthers suffered a rash of injuries in their defensive secondary and signed Eric Reed to play for them. And he led the team in tackles following that signing. He played for Carolina into the next year, at which point, again, his contract ended, and he continues to be out of football, much like Kaepernick, unsigned. And that harkens back a little bit, as I mentioned, to Mahmoud Abdul Rauf.
You've offered an incredible context as both a scholar and somebody who's clearly who clearly closely follows American football.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Which is fantastic. Which is fantastic. But I wonder about the average museum visitor, and without the benefit of this incredible context, how do you think, given your unique point of view, the average museum visitor who's looking at Ezawa's work may interpret what's being communicated or represented by the artist, in light of possibly, of course, knowing about the protest, having various opinions about it, but without all of this wonderful historical and cultural information, how might that viewer engage with this exhibition? Sure,
and thank you, Niall, for that. I think, I'm going to put my professor hat on a little bit, if that's okay, because I would actually say to any viewer coming in to experience the work first on their own terms, which is just aesthetically and emotionally what happens to you when you watch this, what happens when you look at these images. And that's why I wanted to come back to the geometry and the order of the paintings in light boxes. They have a certain order. There's only two people facing away. What happens when we all of a sudden notice them? Why are they the only ones? Why are they facing away from us versus the others? What's their role? Why can't I find Kaepernick right away in that painting? Because I eventually can, but it takes some work. And so when it comes to the film itself, which really takes these things and does so much with them, if you can watch and recognize that it's only 5 times at all that there are people within the frame that are moving, and they are all media members, I would, through close looking, things we teach in early art history and literature classes through paying attention to form. I mean, these are bright, powerful images, right? There's a lot of uniformity. Literally, there are uniforms here. There's a great deal of solidarity. The people who are operating in a different way within that film are all people who are not on teams. And if we can recognize them as the ones who are creating the images, we can recognize, oh, there's image making happening here. Right? And that there is a way then to sort of start stepping back. So yes, I as I said at the beginning, I probably over-enjoy sports in some ways, but I'm also a cultural historian, and so when I first saw this work, as I mentioned in fall 2020, I immediately saw it that way, and I have to tell you, I had a powerful experience with a lot of other people, including some people in this room, who I realized, oh, I see differently than them, just because of, like I usually call myself a bit of a weirdo in this, I just have these weird interests that all of a sudden I can apply here. But they were seeing this through slightly other lenses that had to do with aesthetics, that for the most part were leading them to the same place. That Ezawa himself is taking us to notice these differences and these fractures in what's happening. And the use, I mean, I've talked about it, I've had a number of colleagues talk to me about the sonic presence of the film, not just in the gallery space, but beyond it. So that you're gonna walk into galleries and still hear it. And they said, wow, it sticks with you. And I said, yeah, doesn't it? Uh-huh. I think maybe that's worth thinking about, right? That notion of presence seeping beyond what's happening is also part of the work, and how it's present in not just all these other contexts, but in your experience of even other work once you recognize this. So, yeah.
That actually makes a brilliant segue to a question from one of our virtual attendees here. Would you please share your thoughts on Ezawa's choice of an instrumental rendition of the anthem to accompany it?
I think part of it, well, I can't say for sure. As I said, I'm no expert on authorial choice, I try to stay away from that whenever I read a novel, and that always makes me nervous. Makes me nervous to try to project. I like to say to my students, Shakespeare is dead, but man, we sure do watch Hamlet a lot. I think it's a very powerful rendition. I think it's a very, for me, it mirrors the emotional tone, or at least helps set it for what I'm seeing. It's a calming version. It comes sort of out of a more classical style than a soul rendition, for instance, we might have, or a pop or a country. We certainly hear that a lot. Or a band back you might have heard in the 30s and 40s. Yes, absolutely, which is all you would have had. And one of the things you'll see when I was doing my research for this was talking about how the ability to have speakers to project the sound changed how often the anthem was used, because frankly, you had to pay for the band. Owners didn't want to do that. It's a different business now. They can pay to bring in a country singer or a pop star. There's a lot of money in that Super Bowl. So I think it is a more reflective version of the anthem, and very powerful in its quietude, I'd say. There's a calmness to it within still a power. There's no singing, there's no overemphasizing of particular lines. So I think it becomes much more of an internal space as a viewer and listener, and I think that really nicely complements the experience of looking and sitting and watching it a few times through. I mean, I find that it's about a minute and 37 seconds, I believe, and sitting and watching, that's when I start to notice things, because I'm in that reflective space. I do think the music complements and leads to that very nicely. Yes?
Do you think that we should have visitors to the MAG stop and put their hand on their hearts and listen to the national anthem before they come into the galleries?
You mean to look at this particular film?
That's just in general.
I think that's a great question for the director. It's, I think as I said earlier, humanities professors are very good problem posers. Not so always super interested in answers, or at least being the ones to provide it. But I do think there is something worth thinking about in two regards. Why in some spaces and not others? And And when the use of it is happening, what's at the heart of that relationship that's happening in that space? Why this particular space?
Do you have thoughts about that you can share?
That I can share. I think it's really problematic. I think it's deeply problematic. I think, as I was implying, I think the NFL's equation rhetorically that they embrace, and if you've watched the Super Bowl, you've seen them often flip their camera and their shot to some army base overseas. In 2009, the hosts of the show were in Afghanistan itself as they were hosting the show, and they were dressed in military fatigues. I just found that really problematic. They're not in the military. They're not risking their lives in the same way. I think it belittles the hard work that servicemen and servicewomen do when they do that. Those players being treated rhetorically like that is a problem. I don't think it's good for the players because I think it diminishes what's involved in what they do, which is not easy. And I think it's a diminishment of what happens on the other side too. I think there could be a good argument that we should have it in more spaces if we actually have a conversation about why we're having it, what the function of that anthem is, whether it's patriotism or something else. Because I don't think we talk much about why exactly we play the national anthem. I don't have anything against it. I think, again, being a humanities professor, I think conversations are good. They tell us something about our values.
It's been my experience in the gallery that not all visitors are happy with this piece. And that's a little difficult because I am particularly moved by it. Mm-hmm. But I think I am on that side that I see it as that silent protest that I agree with. Not everyone who comes into our gallery does.
Sure.
And so trying to be, as presenting it, I try to be very objective, but it is difficult. So not everyone sees this in the same way. They have preconceived opinions about this that are pretty difficult to engage.
Absolutely, without a doubt, and thank you for pointing it out. Yeah, no, and so teaching that as I did in the fall of 2016, starting to be, even before this work was conceived, teaching that class with a lot of students who came from military families, a lot of students who had parents in the police department. It was a hard and really valuable conversation where we tried really hard to figure out how to listen to one another and what was going on and what intentions might be, which of course we don't know. We only know what people say. So it became a great place of inquiry, I would say, that the notion of inquiry seemed really valuable for a classroom. But as you can probably imagine, there were a lot of conversations about respect in terms of listening to other people and where people come from. And the listening part is hard, and it was very hard in the fall of 2016. It's been hard for a number of years. But as Weima points out, with how she talks about the 21st century culture war, the bilious churn, it's hard for a lot of us to watch cable television now, isn't it? Because that's all it feels like, rah, rah, right? Just people yelling at one another in some regards. So, and social media makes it worse. I'm not at my best in social media. I'm usually at my worst. And the next day, I'm like, oh, Stephen, again? Really? Such a dope. So in terms of art, I can't say that what I always say to people in terms of how they experience art, literature, what have you, is their emotional response is almost always first, right? And that they need to come to respect that on some level, that that's real and matters. But they should also interrogate their own emotional response and what that's about, whether it's pro, against, right? I'm not sure. I would say to someone that I'm not sure exactly what it means to be against an artwork, that might confuse me a little bit, though I know that someone saying it makes them uncomfortable, and it makes me intellectually and emotionally uncomfortable. I don't want to disrespect that feeling. I want to value it. There's a couple different ways to answer that, which might be that sometimes art does that. Sometimes art's intimidating and frightening. Certainly lots of people come here might be intimidated by some work. I don't know enough about it to appreciate it, to like it. I might not know enough about this contemporary art that seems very performative in ways I don't And other times they might be, I just don't like it. Those are all fine, but it doesn't discredit the work in and of itself. But sometimes arts also makes us uncomfortable. And that's not inherently a bad thing. The protests, in fact, I'd say the protests were meant to make people uncomfortable. They usually are, right? This is what King was talking about in Letter from Birmingham Jail. My job is not to make you feel better. And we're tired of waiting.
From another virtual attendee, your use of the term media mediates has opened a new world of observation. Thank you.
It's not really mine. I'm
I
just
know,
using it
well,
today.
but you said it, so there you go. Another virtual attendee, I'm a writing instructor at the U of R, and one of my students is writing a paper on racism in sports coming from those external to the game itself, fans, coaches, commentators, etc. What would you say is the significance of such findings, as you've noted in your presentation, and do you have any ideas about how we as a society might address this issue? Is the answer protest from the players themselves, or is it the responsibility of fans to fix the issues we cause?
I'm not sure I'm equipped to fully answer that. I do think when I created that class originally, I can tell you that my pitch to the chair of the department that was just forming at the time was that sport is American culture, and American culture is sport. And if we don't recognize that, we're missing what is one of the largest industries in our country. And that, at the time I said to him, and you're starting a sports studies and what's now a sport management program, it seems to me you need a course that does this. The sport reflects who we are. It reflects a lot about our values. The privileging of winning and losing is sort of remarkable to me, because it filters down to Little League baseball played by 6-year-olds. And I'm going to tell you that the kids do not remember who won or lost. All they want is the ice cream after. And that comes, I mean, it doesn't end at 6. It goes all the way up to about 13, 14. That's what they remember, being with friends. But the notion that these are privileged in these ways, sport is just an amazing reflector of what happens. And when you talk to the NFL players, when you hear them talk, they talk about the great diversity of ideology and race and backgrounds in those locker rooms. And that the players themselves are deeply respectful of other people's voices because they need to work as a team. That in fact, they claim they're better at handling it than the fans are. Even if there's disagreement, they know that once that game starts, they have a particular thing that they need to do to succeed in their plans, and that's quite powerful, and perhaps that might be useful outside of the game itself. What does it mean to allow plurality? What does it mean to really allow, appreciate, and work within multiple perspectives? Yes, I think that would be incredibly valuable for all of us. And to tell you the truth, to that person saying, where does this need to arise from, or where does it need to originate in? I think the answer is all of us. You can only start with yourself, of course, but it has to start with who we are and how we live those principles on a daily basis. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Over here.
Yes.
I guess I'm struck by how quietly the protests have spread, such that on the NBA, you see, on college basketball, you see people wearing signs on the back of their jerseys.
That's right.
So in that sense, it seems to me it's been extraordinarily successful in spite of the media. and the NBA negotiating how they're going to, what part the players are going to have and all kinds of things. It just seems like it's been incredibly successful.
Absolutely. Culture moves in very curious ways. I can say as someone who's taught here since 1999 at St. John Fisher, my student body at some level looks very, very similar to when I came. They still dress in happy colors. I moved from New York and I was freaked out by it. No one wore black. No one smoked cigarettes and seemed unhappy. They're all happy, sunny people. And I was like, I don't know what to do with you all. There's no mopey music being played. They're still pretty much like that. But their personal politics have evolved quite a bit since when I came, and their acceptance of what many people call otherness, other experiences, other beliefs, in ways that are really powerful for someone like me to see, and very moving. So culture moves in some ways generationally. At the same time, it also swings back. Culture shifts are on a continuum because we have lots of laws being passed that are more regressive than progressive. And even without getting into the politics of that, there's some ways in which culture and politics are going back to a previous time, even as a younger group of people are changing how other people see things. And I think that's where we live now. I think that's that bilious churn. I think we're in a period of great social and political and cultural upheaval and debate where for me and what I do in my work and what I do as a father and a partner is really try to articulate what I believe in, what I value, and try to center that in my work and in my family. And that's what I try to teach my kids. They're going to make their own choices. Just do it based out of what you believe and you'll be okay. But it's a powerful thing to look at as a cultural historian, to see things really moving in one direction with some people and moving a totally different direction with others. It certainly worries me, for sure. But those movements you're talking about in terms of what's on the back of jerseys and how players are talking and using a platform perhaps in a different way, it's very powerful. They have huge amount of fans. They have a very large cultural voice. For sure. I didn't talk about Muhammad Ali consciously because Muhammad Ali was banned from athletic performance. He didn't choose not to box. He was banned, and so that's slightly different. But Muhammad Ali is certainly a touchstone for a generation of athletes still today. I mean, when I talk to my students, they have no idea who Cassius Clay is. They have no idea about the Vietnam protests. They only see him as sort of a hero. They don't know the cultural disturbance he caused. I'm curious to see, we can see the public reception of Kaepernick has changed radically in 6 years, 5.5 years, really, from when he first knelt to now. And culture keeps evolving. We'll see. I don't know how he'll be. He still wants to play, but he's still not getting that opportunity.
With the help of Nike.
Sure. But then that's a major multinational corporation supporting what some would see as a particular ideological position, and many fans started burning their Nikes. A curious gesture on one level, because they'd already bought them. But, that doesn't mean we might not. On another level, it might be one could argue it's more powerful to burn the things we've chosen before and say, I'm now rejecting what I once embraced. Our political choices our personal choices are certainly political, and perhaps people are seeing them more so that way now.
Isn't the crux of the matter that white people want to own the national anthem?
That's such a big question. Yeah, it is a site of debate, isn't it? And the poem itself is very complicated. The national anthem is just a small part of what Francis Scott Key wrote, and there's been a lot of scholarship on this. It wouldn't take long for people at home to sort of look this up, or for you all on your phones. It's a complicated text. There are moments, it was about the Battle of Baltimore. It took place at a very complicated time in American history with the British and with who was siding with which, the South, and who they were aligning with. There's stuff there about runaway slaves. There's stuff there about freedmen and what's really being fought for. That I think if people read the whole text, they might feel a little more complicated about that being the origin of our national anthem. Many other countries have much different ones. I like "O Canada." Now, I'm not trying to say I want to move to Canada. I don't know, I just like the way it sounds. Listening to hockey games growing up. So, yes, it's much like, it's a powerful cultural site of debate, the national anthem in and of itself. And it's certainly been politicized. People like to think it's being politicized now. It's always been politicized. It never wasn't. Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I just have one comment to make, and I'm sure that as the father of someone who plays sports, you've probably seen this. I have grandchildren, a child who played sports, and one of the things when someone on the field is hurt and down, at least in middle school,
Right.
high school, elementary school, everybody takes a knee.
They take a knee.
They take a knee.
Yeah, out of respect, out of let's just focus on what's happening. Everyone stay in your space so that player, she or he can be cared for. Absolutely. Yeah, it's very powerful to see that, isn't it? Like they all immediately know what to do, right? And how kneeling became somehow then framed as posing a problem.
Exactly.
This is what I'm trying to get at with this notion of what an interesting way to frame a narrative that if we look at it from another angle would be anything but. And as I like to say to my students back then in 2016 when they were really mad he was kneeling, I was like, they're calling it unpatriotic. I'm like, a Green Beret asked him to, and he said, I think that's a great idea. So I'm a little confused how you get there. But in that question of how they got there, there is so much, right? So much. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you.